Hey guys, Fawad here from beattweaks.com, and in this video I'm going to talk about something that you probably watched 100 different tutorials for, watched countless videos on YouTube for, and probably find difficult to master. And that is mixing kick drums so that they work in your tracks. When I first started out producing and learning all this stuff, kicks gave me the hardest time and they were such a pain in the butt. And I came to a realization later that there's a reason for that, especially when you're using sample packs and kick samples from sample packs. The people who make these packs want to sell their samples. So obviously when you listen to a sample on its own, it sounds amazing. It's full, it's fat, it's punchy, but as soon as you put it into your track, it just doesn't work. And then you try to mess around with EQ, with compression, some distortion, you follow advice from tutorials, and for whatever reason, you just can't seem to get it right. Well, mixing kick drums is not easy. It's very difficult because you have to keep a lot of different things in mind when it comes to the kick drum. And at the same time, it's one of the most important elements of electronic dance music, so it's so important to get it right. So with that being said, what I have here is something that's going to make your life a lot easier if you're trying to mix kick drum samples in Ableton Live, and that is a kick drum effects rack, and you can see it right here. This effects rack is designed to make mixing kick drums something that's really easy, that's really intuitive, and that's really simple to do. With just the turning of a few knobs, you can get the exact sound that you want using any sample. The simpler the sample, the cleaner the sample, the better the result is going to be, but you can pretty much use any kick drum sample. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you quickly through the controls of the effects rack, what it does, and why things are set up the way they are. So the first thing we have here on the effects rack is a tuning macro. And this is one of the most important aspects of mixing kick drums that work with your track, and it's also one that's so many times overlooked by producers. You absolutely need to tune your kick drums so that they match at least the key of your track, or, at the very least, the bottom end of your kick works with your sub bass and your bass lines. So this is something really important. The next thing that's also something that's often overlooked by producers is the length of your kick. So a lot of times when you listen to samples from sample packs, they sound huge. A lot of times they have a really long tail to them, a really long boom. Well, most of the time you don't need all of that. So a lot of times you need to shorten your kick drum sample so that it cleans up the bottom end and it doesn't muddy up the mix and it doesn't interfere with your bass line. The next thing we have here is an attack knob, and it's kind of the other way around from the length. So this determines at what point in your sample does the sample actually start. So if I open up the effects here, the first one we have is just simpler. This is where you would drop your samples so that you can use these effects. So what this attack does is it determines at what point the sample actually starts. So this is really useful just in case you don't want a kick drum that has a lot of click to it or a lot of smack to it. You want it to be a little bit more blunt. This is a perfect way to achieve that. The next control we have here is distort and saturate, and this macro here is connected to 3 different plugins and about 7 or 8 different parameters. So it's a very complex setting, but it's very, very carefully set. And the awesome thing about this is that you can make your kicks as colored and as aggressive as you want. You can add a little bit of warmth if you want to, if you don't drive this macro too much, or you can completely trash the sound and add a lot of distortion, a lot of fuzz, and that's going to help your kick cut through the mix. Or if you're looking for that flavor of kick drum, you can add it using this macro here. The next thing we have is compression. Now, compression for kick drums is a lot of times really important because it tightens up the sound and it adds more attack and more punch to the kick drum. So if sometimes you find your kick is not cutting through the mix, or you just want to give it a little bit of that extra factor, A lot of times compression will do the trick. The next thing we have is a simple low cut. And this low cut is connected to this filter here inside of Simpler. And the reason this was done is because you have the option of selecting from a bunch of different filter types. And what I found through a lot of experimentation and research is that the MS2 filter works best for sounds that have a lot of low end to them. It adds a lot of fatness and it just gives a really nice filtered sound. And there's a little bit of resonance to it, and this is really important because when you cut something that has a lot of low end, it tends to sound a little bit weird and it sounds filtered. So the resonance kind of makes up for that a little bit and adds back some of that punch and some of that roundness in the bottom end. The next thing we have here is an EQ macro. And again, just like the distortion and saturation, this is a pretty complex macro. And it's connected to 7 different EQ bands. Each one has been carefully selected. And all the EQ values and the frequencies that were chosen very carefully so that each frequency band has a specific purpose. So if we open up the EQ here and we turn this knob all the way to the right, you can see what's going on with the EQ. So with this all the way to the right, what we have here is a dip in the mids, and this is going to make room for your snare, for your synths. It's going to clean up the kick drum a lot, and it's going to emphasize the top end attack and the low end of the kick drum at the same time. And then here, for example, you have a cut, and this cut is designed to make room for your bass lines so that the kick doesn't muddy up the mix. This boost here is also designed to make up for these cuts, and this works especially well if you are using very short kick drums. So if you change the length here and you make your kick really short, this EQ will add a lot of the low end back to the kick and make it really thick and really punchy, because when you shorten the length of the kick, you lose a lot of the bottom end. So this is, the relationship between the length and the EQ is something really important. And then the last macro here is something that I've called the super punch. And again, it's connected to a pretty complex set of effects, which you can look into if you do get this effects rack. You can look into it. If you open up the super charge rack here or super punch rack here, you can see that there's a parallel processing chain going on here. And it's a very simple 0-1. So you either want it or you don't. All right, so these are the basic controls of this audio effects rack specifically made for mixing electronic kick drums. All right, so enough talking, and let's actually hear what each one of these things does, and then we'll go through an example of actually using it in context with other instruments. All right, so let's solo the kick drum here, and I'll put everything back the way it was, and then we can go through each knob one by one, and you can hear exactly what it's doing. So you can see we've completely transformed a normal 808 sample. So the sample I have loaded in here, and you can use any sample you want. This will work on pretty much any sample you throw in there. This is just a basic 808 kick, and it's a sample inside Ableton Live that I just used. It's a pretty clean 808 kick, and we completely transformed it with just, twisting a few knobs here. So you can see how quickly you can get to the sound that you want. And you can turn one simple sample into 100 different variations and 100 different kinds of kicks. So you can literally make your own sample pack just using this audio effects rack. So I mean, If you come up with a really awesome kick, you can just export it, save it, and you have it as a sample to use for later. It's great to use. All right, so now let's go through an actual example of creating a kick drum that works in the context of an actual mix. So I just have some audio tracks here from a sample pack. And again, I'm going to start with just a clean 808. Just take off all these effects here. Put them back where they were. And first, what I want to do, before you start using these knobs, or, this is just a general mixing rule. Before you start using effects and EQ and compression, make sure the volumes are right. Make sure the volume relationship between the different instruments is set correctly, and then start using effects. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure that the volume of the kick and the volume of all the rest of the different instruments is, approximately where they should be. Okay, so that sounds about right. And if you find yourself not being able to make everything louder, or if the kick is too drowned out, even though it's already at 0 here, then you might want to select everything and just turn all of their volumes down at the same time. All right, and that's going to make the kick louder in relationship. All right, so let's start messing around with these settings here. Let's just close all this stuff. All right, so this is the rack itself, and this is pretty much all you need. And let's get started. All right, so you can see in just a couple of minutes, I was able to tweak all of these parameters here and come up with a few different flavors of kick drum. Each one works with the track in a different way. So what I would suggest you do is actually go in the order that these macros are set in, and then what you can do is tweak them, and you're going to find that you can come up with different combinations and different sounds of kicks, and get creative with it, and you can come up with so many different sounds. Okay, so if you want to get this effects rack for Ableton Live specifically made for mixing awesome sounding kick drums, then click the link in the description below if you're watching this video on YouTube. If you're watching this video on the Beat Tweaks website, then you're going to find a button underneath the video that's going to take you to the purchase page.